Welcome everyone to the Asian American Writers Workshop. It's nice to see you all. My name is Michael Zalta and I'm the programs manager here. A couple of housekeeping remarks before we begin. There are 2 gender neutral bathrooms right there, so if you need it, go for it, please. Masking is required. If you need a mask, we have a bunch over there. We'd be glad to supply you with one. And then finally, there's a quiet space in the back if for whatever reason you need to step away for a phone call, to take a breath, you're more than welcome to. Sound good? Excellent. Okay. So welcome everyone to the Asian American Writers Workshop. For about 30 years, this organization has worked to amplify the voices of Asian Americans. It does so from a radically inclusive space. What that means is it expands the definition not only of what it means to be a writer, but also what it means to be Asian American. At this time, as the genocide in Palestine is ongoing, we thought that it was incredibly important to amplify the voices of pro-Palestinian writers, especially those who are talented, as all of the readers you will hear today. Before we begin, I want to give a huge shout out to Radix Media. Put your hands together for them, please. They're the publisher who put this beautiful book together, and now I'm going to hand it over to Meher to tell you a little bit more about the organization. Meher.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming on a Tuesday evening. The weather is just getting a little nice, so I appreciate everybody who willingly stays indoors, and especially in the next couple of months. Thank you all for joining us today to celebrate the book launch of this incredible debut. This essay collection by Noam Keim, called The Land is Holy. That is what unites all of us today in this room, at the very least. I want to tell you a little bit about Radix. We are a worker-owned, unionized print shop and independent publisher. We're based in Brooklyn, New York. We're just a little farther, just a little close. No, what's the word? Just near Atlantic Avenue, Barclays. That's what I wanted to say. Couldn't figure out the location of that. Yeah, so we're very close to Atlantic Avenue, Barclays. We've been operating as a print shop for the last decade and as a publisher for a little over 5 years. We are a small publisher, so we try to print about 2 to 3 titles a year. And our intentionality with the work that we pick is that we want it to be really good fucking literature. But other than that, we are drawn to work that is political, that is, audacious, that is experimental, and that is written by voices from the margins. We like to work with underrepresented writers, emerging writers, and we like to, we have diverse tastes. And because we're one of the few publishers who are completely non-hierarchical, we often do the job of convincing each other of a book that works for us. And we all have different tastes. So we do everything from poetry, fiction, nonfiction, graphic novels, speculative fiction, zines, everything. So that's a little bit about us. We used to be Radix Media, but we've since, no, you're good. We're sort of transitioning into our new identity. We are now just Radix, or Radix Cooperative Printing and Publishing, which is a mouthful. So Radix, like just Madonna is fine. And so I want to tell you a little bit about The Land is Holy. The Land is Holy came about as part of the Megaphone Prize, which is an annual prize that we run to recognize and publish debut writers of color. The idea is to be the publishers to bring in these works into the world, and to also look at some of the interesting voices that are coming up in across genres. So we switch the genres every year. The first year we did poetry chapbooks, and we published works by Gilma Johari and Jinjin Chu, who some of you may be aware of, very important members of the Asian American Writers Workshop community. The year after that, we did short story collections, and the third year, we did essay collections, and we were very honored to have the incredible Hanif Abdurraqib come on as guest judge, who picked this incredible debut that you'll get to familiarize yourselves with a little bit today. The joy of working on The Land is Holy, it's really funny, I was putting up an Instagram caption right before this, so I'm just going to probably repurpose some of that here. But to address some of what Muhammad just said, we are living through an active genocide, one among several genocides happening at the same time, happening synchronously. And as writers, sometimes you wonder, you look at this practice, you look at this craft, and you think, how useless, something like this can be, because it cannot stop a genocide, right? It can perhaps move and compel people to think harder, but when it comes to action, how much can writing really achieve? And as a writer myself, I've often looked at my work and have thought that, I found it futile. I found the practice futile, particularly in the last 7 months, as these images have proliferated all over our social media. At such a time, I can only say for myself that, and hopefully this might be the case for some of you who will, read this book, that The Land is Holy was such a salve for me. It is incredible to come across a book that has such a clarified moral and political conscience that wears, with such clarity, its outlook towards the world, its tenderness towards the soft inhabitants of our natural world, but also its fierce protection of its people. It has been an absolute joy to work on this book with Noam, who is, a wonderful, deeply, conscientious person who puts into practice everything that their words echo. I'm really honored to offer this book to you. It looks beautiful. We designed and printed it ourselves. It has letterpress covers. It is really nice paper. It's a beautiful item to look at. So please check it out, and please give this incredible new voice a space on your bookshelves. Books are at the back. If you already have a copy, great. Otherwise, if you just want to come and chat, please come and chat with us. I'm going to hand over the mic to Mohammed and let the event continue.
This is an exciting time, and publishers like Radix are very important, so please do support them. Now I'm going to bring up your first reader for the evening. Sarah Aziza is a Palestinian American writer who splits her time between Brooklyn and the Middle East. Her work has appeared in The New Yorker, The Baffler, Harper's Mag, The New York Times, Lux Magazine, among others. Previously a Fulbright Fellow in Jordan, she was a 2022 resident at Tin House's Writers Workshop and a 2023 Margins Fellow here at the Asian American Writers Workshop. She's currently working on her first book, a hybrid of work of memoir, lyricism, and oral history. Please put your hands together for Sarah Aziza.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm honored to be here. I'm always honored to be in this space. And thank you, Noam, for sharing a little bit of your evening, your special night with me. Your work is beautiful, and I'm so glad to see it out in the world. So, yeah, as Mohammed said, I'm working on a book, which I'm going to read a little bit from for you as a way to just warm us up for the main event. Noam's work deals a lot with ancestors and with land, so I'm going to read a few excerpts from my manuscript, which does deal a lot with ancestors and land. So you'll hear me reference first she. I'm speaking here of my grandmother. And I'm going to take you back to the 1950s first, to Gaza, and we'll travel from there. In the realm of maps and records, her trace has always been slight. Born without a birth certificate, her name was first written in 1955. A UN worker made the inscription, once in English, once in French, and handed her the paper slip. Her name, a token traded for sugar and wheat in languages she couldn't read. She would have been roughly 30 then, a refugee of 7 years, mother to a daughter and 3 sons. Before, in her Palestinian village of 600, names were kept by heart. She was Bint Muhammad al-Mukhtar ibn Yusuf. Her lineage, a chain of masculine names, a tether to time and place. Her town itself, Radix, first appeared in Ottoman files in 1596 and may date to the Byzantine period between the 3rd and 6th centuries. The officials marked down 35 households that year, not bothering with names. Their interest was in noam, the rich fields yielding wheat, barley, and honeybees. Later, the villagers added grapes and oranges alongside olives, chickens, and mishmish. Hundreds of towns like Radix dotted the rolling countryside. Each had its defining feature, preserved in stories, poetry. Radix's boast was its jameza, the stately sycamore tree. Hurriya was the name given to her when she was born. Hurriya, easy to mistake for Hurriya, freedom. Sometimes I wish that was her name. The meaning of Hurriya is not fixed, but hovers around beautiful woman. Sometimes translated as nymph, a word found centuries back in poetry and Quranic verse. In English, it can also be rendered as dark-eyed beauty, sometimes virgin of paradise. Some hadith, hinting at colorism, describe a woman so gorgeous her flesh glows translucent. Is that what makes an angel? Something desired and vanishing? She was translucent for me too, for all those years. So easy to see through. Yet her girlhood was a sturdy-bodied thing, her name double known. She was daughter of the Mukhtar, chosen one, a mayor of sorts appointed to lead village affairs. Mother was multiple. She was raised by her father's several wives. Then, after her father's death and mother's remarriage to a man on the Gazan coast, her brother Fauzi's bride. In their home, Hurriya's world was a weave of half-siblings, cousins, and the guests Fauzi entertained. Like most other girls, my grandmother was never sent to school. Instead of pencils, her fingers grew deft at the window, spark quick as she flipped their white bellies over the flame. As a young wife, she carried lunch daily to her husband in the field. Passing neighbors on the way, they embroidered greetings in the air. She set the basket of bread at her husband Musa's feet. May Allah give you strength. Receiving, he returned, may God bless your hands. After eating, she yoked her afternoon to his. Together, they sowed ancestor soil until evening called them in. These were the days tucked inside her, hidden from my father and from me. Hurriya embalmed her childhood in silence, Ebdis suspended in innocence. My father would only begin to grasp this decades later, following his mother through ruins, the past spelled in scattered stone. His timeline began in Deir al-Balah, a city in Gaza noted not for its sycamore, but its date palms. Born there in 1960, his birth was registered by the Egyptian authorities, who, in 1948, replaced British occupiers after halting Israel's southern advance. On his birth certificate, Ibtis hovers in the white space around the words Gaza Strip. Hurriya welcomed Ziad in a UN clinic alone. She walked home with her newborn, buoyant with her squirming miracle. By this time, Hurriya had built 2 rooms on an empty lot she requisitioned after months on an NGO housing list. The only furniture stood in the sand outside, an old table her second-born, Ibrahim, used as a desk. To its left, an area for kneading dough and a banana tree that refused fruit. Like any child, my father was born to trust. Gaza was Philistine, was home, was the world. Ziad loved the small path his days carved, barefoot between his mother's lap and the beach. Mornings, he woke to the coo of the pigeons, a flock of birds Hurriya raised and cooked on Friday after prayers. At these meals, he jostled his brothers for a double portion of meat. Above him, history webbed, conjured in the words of Hurriya and her guest. From time to time, he heard a moan slip from one and caught a chill. He glanced up to see his mother's head shake, shoulders slack. But these were only passing, distant clouds. Ibtis, war, and even your father, seldom spoken directly, these words had no bodies, no weight. With before locked away, he did not see his life as aftermath. Silence may have many parents. There are kinds of love that stop language in its tracks. Perhaps she held back Ibtis's name to save it from the past tense. An absence spoken gathers mass, asking the body to bear it twice. Maybe her silence was a refusal, a declaration that grief should not be her son's inheritance. In the end, survival is a language a temporality all its own. Inside it, days and lifetimes may appear the same size, 3 meals and a roof. Yet forgetfulness is a dream the body may deny. Radix needed no speaking, it echoed in everything. It circled the eyes of her cousins, young men who daily paced lost acres in their heads. It hovered in the taste of bread, baked from UN-issued flour. The flat sameness of its texture recalled the way dough in Radix rippled grainy with hand-milled kameh. Each bite, a morsel of the months past, rain or dryness, farmers' worry, hands plucking, then grinding the kernels of gold. I'll read just a little bit further, flash forward to 2013. This is my father, my brother, and I traveling to Radix. I agreed to this search, but Radix was a word so unknown to me, even my curiosity was vague. On the 2-hour drive south from Jerusalem, I watched the landscape shift from rich green to arid plains. Off and on, our route skimmed along the hulking separation wall that cleaved through the West Bank. Beyond, Jewish settlements, whole towns and cities of them perched on Palestinian hills. My father sighed periodically, shaking his head and muttering angry appeals to Allah. I felt the mixture of fury and impotence that had become familiar. Beside me, my brother said nothing. I was dozing when our car moved off the highway and onto a rattling dirt road. I sat up to see a parched brown field. In the distance, a line of electrical towers partitioned the horizon and the sky. The car parked. Emerging, my father squinted, scraping the landscape for clues. In his hand, a few printed pages of directions gathered from a crowdsourced Palestinian database fluttered in his hands. It's changed, he muttered. Brittle, bleached grass clutched the raised earth. Pale watermelons dotted the air. Silence blistered our skin. A massive sycamore shimmered darkly in the middle distance. My father fixed his sight on the dense leaves and began walking. We followed, watching him bend to pick up a dry stick and gently swat stalks of dry grass. Over the cracked earth, my father's words summoned crops, ripples of green and gold. This was where my mother would have walked back and forth to the field. This was the Jamaiza she spoke about. On the ground, young figs lay scattered, unripe. We bit into them and puckered at the starchy salad. I swallowed anyway, suddenly desperate to put this place inside of me. I think I'm out of time. So thank you so much.
Keep going for Sarah Aziza, how you doing? Shout out to that incredible excerpt. We hope to read your book when it comes out soon. The whole world will know about it. We'll make sure they do. Of course. And now for Noam Keim. Noam Keim is a trauma worker, medicine maker, and flaneur freak. After graduating from their master's in American visual culture, Noam moved to Ann Arbor, Michigan for a fellowship. Many tribulations with immigration later, they now live on stolen Syrian Lenape Land, known as Philadelphia, where they build webs of support for individuals impacted by carceral systems. They believe that their childhood anti-zionist beliefs is what brought them to their abolitionist practices. Their nonfiction writing weaves themes close to their heart: reverence to the land, healing, queerness, colonialism, plants, abolition. They are a Lambda Literary 22 Emerging LGBTQ Voices Fellow, Tin House Winter Workshop 23 participant, and a Sewanee 23 contributor. Connect on Twitter and Instagram, The Land is Holy, or thelandisholy.com. Please put your hands together for Noam Keim.
Hi, your reading was incredible, and I feel like it will sit with me forever. So I wanted to say that before I get started. Thank you, everybody, for being here. It's weird to write a book about trauma and then experience all this joy, you know? And I'm going to sit with that for a second. Speaking of trauma, I'm gonna be reading an essay called The Aoudats. And it's a little too long, so I'm gonna just jump from section to section and hopefully it will make sense to you. Yeah. When I think about home, I think about Marrakesh, the place I've only been 2 months as part of an ill-planned family vacation with my parents and younger sibling in 1999. I don't think about my current house to which I own a deed, the many apartments I rented over the years, or the one I was raised in. When I think about Marrakesh, I don't think about the terrible all-inclusive hotel we stayed in, or the scams my parents kept falling for. I don't think about the shame I felt walking with them, crude and isolated from every other family in the hotel who was having a good time, while we ate our dinners in silence. I think about the mellah of my grandparents' childhood, a place that only lives in the memory of the dead. Safta Zohara and Saba Eliyahu told me and the rest of the family that their love story started in childhood. They told us that they had to leave so that they could be together, and that it was the reason why they left Morocco in the late 1940s. The love alone was meant to explain leaving families behind, transiting through Marseille in a refugee camp in the Zionist state. Their love alone explained a life built on the desert that was home to other people, away from the imperial city of their childhood and the grave of their beloved ancestors. Safta Zohara and Saba Eliyahu are both dead now, and my mother and father might as well be. So all that is left for me is genealogy websites, history books, psychics, and my imagination. It isn't much, but it is the way I try to tell myself the story of a home abandoned. It is the way I get to explain the tears that come up when I hear Arabic, the comfort of sand under my bare feet, and my affinity for mint, rue, rosemary, rose, and wormwood. I know that Safta Zohara and Saba Eliyahu flattened their story to make it palatable. I know that they were both part of a moment in history when Arab Jews were manipulated to leave their homelands to populate the lower echelons of the Zionist state and justify the rejection of Arabness as a whole. I know that because their story of migration is the story of thousands of people, the books and websites have taught me. In 1957, a year after my mother was born in the occupied city where parents were placed by the Zionist authorities, a city currently known as Beersheba, Texas wildlife officials released about 40 aoudats in the Palo Duro Canyon to offer hunting opportunities to ranchers. In English, the aoudat is also called the Barbary sheep, as in the sheep from the Barbary Coast, the 15th century term that described the North African littoral west of Egypt, as in the coast of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, as in what my people have known as Al-Maghrib, the Maghreb, the West. The first record of an aoudad on the American continent dates to a zoo in Jersey in 1900. They brought them by boats from the ports of Africa to the coasts of Turtle Island. Mountain goats extracted from the desert where they thrived in spaces that look impossible to the human eye, to be placed behind the protection of fences, to be observed and enjoyed by the crowds of the eastern seaboard. I wonder if, in the zoo of Jersey in 1900, they built structures that resembled the rocks aoudads climbed in their home landscape. I wonder if, in the zoo of Jersey, they marveled at how little water they needed to survive. As the aoudads settled in their new artificial habitat, their numbers grew too fast for the zoos to keep up with the new generations of desert sheep. So when the longhorn population dwindled in the American West because their habitat was being decimated, it made sense to replace them with their North African cousins, who bred so fast that not even the ferocity of Texan hunters could eradicate them, as if their lives could be swapped without any consequences, as if introducing the aoudad to the American West could negate the destruction already underway. Just like that, they plopped Barbary sheep in a canyon of the American West, hoping that they would adapt like they did in the zoo in Jersey and the other enclosed environments in which they had thrived before. They did thrive, adapting so well that they became part of a threat of destruction, displacing the remaining longhorns and a multitude of plants and smaller members of the Texan ecosystems. The aoudads followed the rules of the land they were asked to live in. I first heard about the aoudads of Texas on a winter day of the pandemic on the archaeological site of the Waco tanks, a 40-minute drive from the city of El Paso. Skip a little bit the description of that. The ranger who guided us through the park, a requirement to see the pictographs, told us about the aoudads and the ways they had adapted to this site 3 cyanide mountains that look like oversized piles of rocks that have been home to many indigenous lineages before becoming a park. She told us that as she asked us to reflect on the privilege it was for us all to stand and walk on land that is sacred to people who survived genocide. She asked us to remember that we were on land stolen from people still alive today. She asked that of our group, mostly made of retired Americans living year-round in RVs, circling sacred land around Turtle Island. Aside from a young indigenous woman reclaiming the sacred land of her people, who were the youngest in the crowd. We walked through the trails lined with chaparral, ocotillo, and mosquito bushes, surrounded by rocks, as our guide pointed at pictographs from civilization long gone. Horses, frogs, corn, painted in red pigment in deep corners of the rock formation. Around us, we saw traces of Aoudad activity everywhere, scat mostly. It was then that our guide told us that the Aoudad was called the Barbary sheep. She didn't know, but it made me want to meet them. Ken. I skipped this one too. Zohara and Eliyahu were part of a large and diverse Jewish community living in the Red City. Until 1948 and the creation of a Zionist state, there were 300,000 Jews living in Morocco. Dispersed in the city's mellachs, the Jewish neighborhoods. Mellach, salt in English, as in the salt marshes of the original neighborhood of Fez, created in 1438, that became the name for all the Jewish neighborhoods around the kingdom. Today, there's a few thousand Jewish people left, mostly in Casablanca, and the various mellachs of the Moroccan kingdom have transformed into other neighborhoods, swallowed by history and shifting geographies. When my grandparents were living in the imperial city of Marrakesh, there were 15,000 others living in the Jewish neighborhood built in the 1560s. You might notice that I say neighborhood and not ghetto, because I don't want you to think that in Morocco they treated the Jews like they did in Europe. While my European ancestors carried the weight of pogroms, persecution, and segregation, life in Morocco was different. Before the Mellah, the Jews lived amongst the Moors and the Muslims, protected by the Dima, the law of Islam protecting non-Muslims' life, religion, and property in exchange for their loyalty to the state. The loyalty was an easy feat, as Judaism believes in Dina de Malchuta Dina, the law of the land that is seen as superseding even the laws of Judaism, a well-matched people. 50 miles from the imperial city of Marrakesh lies the base of the mountains of the High Atlas, the highest range of North Africa. It's a landscape of sparse vegetation and high altitude that has protected its inhabitants from numerous waves of invasion in the kingdom. The impenetrable ridge has been the home of many animals who do not survive anywhere else. The bearded vulture, the Barbary leopard, the Atlas day gecko, the Aoudad. One of the richest ecosystems in this part of the world. I have never seen the Atlas Mountains. In November 1979, on Turtle Island, 116 miles away from the Palo Duro Canyon, a national group of wildlife management experts meets somewhere in the Texas Tech University in Lubbock, Texas. They are holding the first symposium on ecology and management of the Barbary sheep, organized by C. David Simpson. 50 experts are gathered to discuss the ways to address the issues in question posed by the Barbary sheep that has proliferated on the American continent. They are discussing what, in ecology, is called an alien species, animals who live outside of their natural home range. Other terms used to describe exotic species: introduced species, adventive species, immigrant species, foreign species, non-indigenous species, non-native species, alien species, kin. In 1999, I walked through the Mellah to visit my great-grandparents' grave and take pictures that would be sent back to my mother's parents. My mother had gathered information that led us to follow an old man through the maze of graves of the Miara Cemetery. My mother took pictures with a camera, pictures she'd developed and sent to her own parents. The memories are almost gone, yet I remember that after the cemetery, we stood in front of my grandfather's childhood home, a riad that looked like all riads, didn't look like anything from the street. We were a strange group of people standing in the middle of the street, my father catching everybody's attention. Ali Baba, Ali Baba, they would say, because that's what people yell in Morocco to Western tourists, and my father was one of them. My parents tried to talk to people, tell them that it was the house in which my mother's father was born, and the energy in the street shifted. In that memory, there's a conversation in which I'm being told that there is now a Muslim family living in my grandfather's home, followed by stones being thrown at our carriage as we drive off. not enough to make sense of the moment. I learned about the history of the Mulhouse in my home on Turtle Island, in one of the largest cities of the largest settler colonial state in human history. Amongst the knickknacks accumulated over the years, I learned about my ancestors' homes in books written in English by people who have built their careers telling the stories of people who are not theirs. I spent a lot of time in my home thinking about ancestors and ancestral lands. Like everybody in my lineage, I'm haunted by the dead. I'm haunted by a need to make sense of my own place in the world from the fragmented remains left by the forced movement of my elders. When I think about home in the Mulhouse of my ancestors, I conveniently edit the generation that colonized Palestine. I edit it because in this story, I want to place myself on a land that was ours. I want to place myself as part of a lineage of belonging. I edit it because when I think about home, I do sometimes think about the desert I was born in, but that's a complicated story that me and my body need to reckon with in other settings. When I think about home, I don't want you to think that I believe Palestine to be my home. I need you to know that Palestine should be free from the river to the sea without the in it. I want you to know that all our freedoms depend on it because there isn't a home for anybody without a free Palestine. I'm going to maybe move here. My body is made out of bones and muscles and mucus, but it is also made out of water and memories and particles and stardust and magic. Every plant that my ancestors ingested continues to live in my body, and every one of their fears became embedded in my DNA. Their experience of their environment shaped the body that I live in today. I wonder if the Aldads of Texas and I have been witnessed by the same landscapes in our ancestral lands. I want to believe that we carry in our bodies and bones and blood the particles of the leaves and flowers that saw our lineages past. I will skip to the end, and I'm sorry for spoiling that for you. A week ago, my estranged mother sends me a string of emails to let me know they're selling my childhood home. I left that home for the last time a decade ago, and with it, my relationship with the people who hurt me the most. The emails are in my trash folder where all our emails get filtered. There's been a lot of emails since I've told her our relationship is over. There's been an incessant flow of unprompted boundary breaches over the years. My mother knows how to make me feel haunted. She knows how to make me feel like no matter how far I go, I cannot escape the environment that raised me. In her emails, she sent me pictures of pictures that made her sentimental for a relationship. She only sends me pictures where she is happy. She only sends me pictures that mean something to her, not to me. I've always been an accessory to her feelings. In the email is a picture of our 1999 trip to Marrakesh. My mother, my father, and I are standing in front of an arch in the Medina of Marrakesh. I am 14 years old, my hair is cropped short, and I'm wearing bell-bottom jeans, platform shoes, and a military bag, decorated with small paintings made with glow-in-the-dark paint. Just like all the other pictures my mother sends me, I don't recall the photograph ever being taken. Over the years, her emails have sent me in spirals of shame and rage and grief. She usually writes them as if an invisible audience could read them too, peppering them with niceties, as if we had only forgotten to call each other lately. Her reality is a fiction that she's trying to force me to accept, one in which my silence is unreasonable and warranted. After each email, I will cry and process some more. Each email feels like a pointed reminder that no matter what I do, I will never heal from this. This time around, as I open each picture that she sends, I notice myself moving quicker through the crisis. She cannot touch me anymore. My mother has lost her power over me. I notice myself appreciating the pictures, noting details of my outfit, paying attention to my crooked childhood teeth. I download the pictures and drag the message to the trash again. After I close my computer, I sit with the news. They are selling our home. I will never see my childhood room again. I will never have access to books and records and trinkets I left behind. I was never going to be able to do that anyway, but the certainty hits my solar plexus with force. I guess this is what my mother wanted me to feel because grief is the only way she will ever have access to me again. A few days later, as I continue to think about this email, I end up grateful for the reminder of her cruelty because it cuts through the nostalgia that sometimes engulfs me. In times when the guilt of leaving, the guilt of starting over becomes unbearable, I think about the emails that discard my own feelings. The reason why I had to rebuild myself somewhere else. And there is no shortage of nostalgia or guilt. I don't think you ever move on from leaving a life behind. I don't think your body ever adjusts, and mine still wants to hop on a plane, knock on my mother's door, and let her caress my hair while crushing my soul until I'm so small I disappear. I don't think you change languages and foods and continents without ever feeling like you made a mistake. We wish to rewind and try another path. Nostalgia is a funny feeling. It is the memory of something that wasn't quite that and that will never be again. I remember my homelands in ways that they might have been, but never will be again. My mother remembers me differently than I ever was. I never came out to her because it never felt safe. I remember her as whoever she was 10 years ago, and every single detail I gleaned from her unhinged, desperate attempts at touching me since then. She probably learns about who I am through her internet searches, trying to find remnants of the child I used to be, rejecting every bit that doesn't match her memory of me. And I do that too. When I let myself linger in the memory of the Mellah for too long, when I imagine myself in Audad climbing Jbel Tukbal, and when I try to rebuild memories from books and internet searches, when I idealize a life that others left, a life rendered impossible in this version of the world, I am nostalgic for a life that was never mine, in a desert that only lives in my body because of the nostalgia of others. Ken.
Keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. Always fantastic and beautiful. Thank you, Noam. I wish I could convey to you all how important readings like this are, how important Sada's words are, how important Noam's words are, but I don't think I can, so I'm just going to leave that to history. Now I'd like to invite up Noam's conversation partner, Michael Zalta. Michael is a queer Syrian American playwright, producer, editor, and scholar who was raised in the Orthodox Syrian Jewish community of Brooklyn. His dramatic writing has been developed and presented at the Lark, the LaGuardia Performing Arts Center, NYU's Jerry H. Labowitz Theater, amongst other places. His critical writing has been published by Zaman Collective and Protocols. He is presently working toward his PhD at USC's Department of Comparative Literature and Culture, where he focuses on the aesthetics of 20th century Marxist movements in the Arab world, Palestinian cinema, and the modern history of Levant and Jewry. Please put your hands together for Michael.
I know I get in the hot seat over here. Thank you so much for it's just beautiful reading. Thank you so much for this invitation to be in conversation with you, the Asian American Writers Workshop and Radix. It really was such a pleasure and privilege and honor to engage with your text. And it opened up so many things that I've really been thinking about for years, but especially, you know, in light of what's going on and in light of especially how people like us, like Arab Jews, are responding to the urgency of, you know, the post-October 7th moment. So I prepared a bunch of, I think, heavy lifting questions for you, but I mean, I also want to ask more just questions that are oriented towards, you know, your writing technique and style and text. So if I can start, I mean, this chapter that you just read, I thought was like one of the most evocative pieces of the entire text. And it was, I told you the other day, it was my favorite, and I was so excited that you were reading it. But I think something that it really demonstrates is your incredible use of extended metaphor throughout the text, especially here with the Audats. And I guess just a really simple question, if you can describe your research process, how you came across, you know, all of these incredibly resonant and serendipitous metaphors and objects that really spoke to the really deep and profound descriptions of sensations of exile and longing and implication. I mean, it was just sort of amazing. This Audad is an example, but you know, it extends to so many. Each chapter is organized around a different object that is so evocative. So I just want to know more about the process of research.
So I was trained as an academic, and then I dropped out of my PhD. And so I feel like I still have like this like obsessive research thing, and I do have access to like academic databases. And so with the Audads, it was like, you know, I was in that place, and like I hear about this, gonna start cursing, I'm sorry. This fucking sheep that's like from Morocco, and it's like in Texas, right? And I'm like, what is going on? Like, how is that like this animal is like here? it makes, it doesn't make any sense. And then like, I was, I'm a Googler, so I'm like, what's going on? And then I read about those ranches in Texas where people pay money to kill Audax, right? It's like this, which is bonkers. And so then I think that like, I tend to like ask a bajillion questions and then I'm like, wait, how does that work? When did they come to the US? Who brought them in? Like, what is going on? And I feel like, there's definitely an element of magic there where it's like, I feel like the metaphor, like kind of like comes together on its own and like this, like really, I'm really obsessive and like I will think about it for a long time and my brain kind of like works in patterns like this where I learn a bunch of things and then like kind of puts it together. Our Aquarian thing, I think, is like a share.
Conspiratorial.
Yeah, just like there's
Conspiratorial,
something.
metaphorical, yeah.
But I think that like for all those essays, right, for like there's the piece about like what does it mean to me and what does it feel like in my body, right? And like with the Audads, I was just like, it was like February of 2022. I was burned out. I had just spent like the last 2 years like seeing people come out of prison in a world that had drastically changed, people being triggered by like lockdown because I work with people who have been in solitary confinement. So I was exhausted and I needed hope. And then there was the sheep in Texas. And I was like, this is my sign, And I feel like for a lot of those essays, part of like the project was that, like finding hope for myself and finding grounding. And so academics might argue that I choose the facts that I want to use for my metaphor, and maybe like discard some of them, but I think that's okay too,
I found it so incredibly not contrived that I was just like astounded at every page, but yeah. And I guess another question towards the ends of like style and form, I'm wondering about the form itself. I mean, we're jumping through different memories, different places, different sort of experiences. I know you have this beautiful chapter that's also a homage to Walter Benjamin. And I think that there's some sort of relationship between the structure of your text and how you describe, his flaniership. So I would love to hear more about just sort of what the organizing logic of the text was.
So I think that this is just how I write. I think that in workshop buddies, sometimes I drive people a little cuckoo because like I really just write like this. And I will say that like the trauma worker in me wants to talk about maybe about complex PTSD, which is an underlying tone of this collection, which is like part of the project was for me to try to figure out how do I heal from all the bad things that happened to me in childhood. And trauma, the way I describe trauma to my clients is that it's time travel, right? It's like you experience the future and the past and the present at the same time. And often and I think it's a beautiful gift to be a time traveler. However, just like any gift, you have to learn how to actually not get stuck on the timeline. And with CPTSD specifically, the way it works is that the triggers are feelings. So whenever you have a feeling that you experienced as a child, then you're like kind of stuck again in that mindset. And it's much harder to like actually acknowledge for yourself than like, like a flashback, right? Because you're just like, this is a feeling I've experienced my whole life, right? I'm feeling shame. I've always been shamed, right? Like there's no problem with that. And so I think that because of that, the way my brain functions is that I think about the past, the present, and the future at the same time, and I continuously move through them. And hopefully as I heal more from it, I will start thinking in linear time. But also maybe as Jews, that the spirals of time are like a big thing in like Jewish tradition, right? Of thinking about time as not like a linear thing, but kind of like as this spiral where we're thinking about the ancestors and coming to, like, and like even with the names, right? Like in the Jewish tradition, you give the name of like the dead to the next generation, and it creates, this like continuous timeline, right? And I think about that a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really beautiful, and I think it leads to the next question really well, which is also about this sort of unstable, I guess, definition of home in the text that I think especially is pronounced in this chapter, but also kind of, plays its role throughout the text. And my question has more to do with how this text can be categorized or qualified as a diasporic text, but also how it really interestingly, I think, eschews the sort of romance of return, this sort of like diasporic longing for a return that feels very intrinsic to that genre, to that style. And I think there's something politically necessary about that intervention that you're making. But I was wondering if you could just speak to the concept of home in the text, its diasporism, and perhaps how it thinks about romantically or tragically what return might look like.
Yeah. Okay, so I have two lines of thought about it. Maybe the first one is that I was raised by people who were stuck in the past, right? Like, I'm like the grandchild of Holocaust survivors on one side, and you know, like the constant memory, right? Like you're constantly in the wound, you're in the wound, you're in the wound, you're in the wound, and like, and you know, on my mother's side, the more like Zionist, like, you know, ideology is also, you know, founded on the wound. And so, and that has always felt really claustrophobic to me, right? Where it just felt like you can never escape it. And like it, what I saw in my elders is that it prevented them from doing anything. Like my grandmother, like on my father's side, she was in Strasbourg in northeastern France when like France was invaded. And so they were moved to a refugee camp in southwestern France. And that's where she spent the war. And then she lost a leg while doing their working camp, whatever, not whatever, but you get the picture. And she always wanted to go back to that region, and she never did. And there was always reasons why she would never go back to that region after she came back to Strasbourg at the end of the war. And like, she talked about it all the time, and she just never went there. And it's like literally a 6-hour drive, or like, you know, it's not that deep. She could have done it, but there was always a reason not to. And I feel like that is a lot of the examples that like I've experienced in my upbringing. And then maybe the second line of thoughts, which is more interesting in my opinion, is that actually the essay that I read to you is completely outdated because I just spent 2 months in Morocco, and actually I've seen the Atlas Mountains now and been to Marrakesh. So sorry about that, I totally lied. I did not see an owl, I will say that. But what I think that like, I know what it looks like when Jewish people show up in Morocco, trying to find like the remnants of like the family, right? And like what my parents actually did, which is like show up in a country, being super Islamophobic, not wanting to engage with the culture of a country, and just wanting to find, you know, like the little clues of like, this is where we belong, you know, without wanting to like build that relationship with a country. And I despise that. And I think that that's not how you should be in the world. And what happened is I went to Morocco, and everybody that I met in Morocco would do this thing where they will pull out their phone and show me a picture of their relative and be like, you look like my niece, you look like my blah, blah, blah. And everybody was like, you're Moroccan, you're one of us. And I think that that has shifted something about how I understand home and belonging. And I met with my ancestral healer at the end of my trip to Morocco. Stick with me for a second. And I was, it's a thing, it's in the book, you'll understand. And I was asking her, are the ancestors telling me to go back to Morocco, right? Like, is that like actually because I was feeling this pull? And the ancestors were like, no, we're not telling you what to do. And we definitely don't want you to think that you have to go back to Morocco to live in our wound. And I was like, okay, what does that mean? And they were like, well, you can move there if you want to. And for you to build a new path in the lineage, but don't use us as an excuse to stay in the wound. And I think that that's how I understand, you know, this question of nostalgia, where like, I don't need to like live my ancestors' wound. Like they live in my DNA. I'm good, you know, like I will live with that forever. How do I create like new pathways for myself?
Yeah.
Freedom.
That basically answers my next question, but it's, yeah, I mean, I think like that impasse of the desire for home is really strong. You really, you know, have a chokehold over your ability to inhabit yourself and your history and your belonging in ways that actually like make you flourish.
Can I add something?
Please.
Yes. Because I think that I also want to ground this book as like, as a trans non-binary person, right? Where I think that also for a lot of us, we know that like our primal home of our body might never be what we want it to be, right? and that there is this constant longing too, right? So again, Aquarius moon.
Mhm.
Like I feel like I'm never going to feel like completely at home.
Mhm.
And I feel like there's something that I'm trying to be okay with
Mhm.
too, you know?
Mhm.
Also in French, we don't have a concept of home. Like we think about maison as like the house, but like there's not, like home is actually a concept in English that I didn't grow up with. So maybe I do want to say that to you.
Yeah. So another question that I have for you, and this has to do with part of what you read later in this section, but it's this description of your relationship with your mother.
Mhm.
And I think in some ways that relationship is tied to this rejection to, swallow the pathologies that you diagnose in the family in different ways. But what you do really interestingly to the reader, and I don't want to spoil
Yeah,
it, but
go for
maybe
it.
it's a reverse spoil because basically we are never told. We never get to witness the scene of rupture between you and your mother and several other family members. And for me, I think that there's something tied to also your description of the Moroccan Jewish world, that we never necessarily sit with the tragedy and the trauma of the forced migration of Jews from different places in the Arab world, which seems to be a major tendency in this genre of literature. So I'm wondering about those two choices, to deny the reader access to that scene and to also really not force the reader to sit in the tragedy.
Yeah, I think that like there's this thing about like when you write nonfiction, there's this thing where you kind of feel like you have to like cut yourself and show how you bleed and be like, I'm human, look. And I feel like as, those of us who have a mother wound know that like it's one of the most difficult thing to carry, right? Because like even when we're thinking about home, right? It's like your first home with your primary caregiver. Like I didn't have that. And it's really like, there's the shame, tons of shame of like, why couldn't I be loved by my mother the way I deserve to be loved, right? And that's a real thing. And I wanted to be able to say that because I really wanted to move through it and be like, you know what, for years, I've lived a really small life because I didn't want her to find me and I didn't want to be like in communication with her, and she's really good at finding me. And I need to be able to actually like open to the world and not just hide forever. And at the same time, I don't want you to tell you, I don't want to tell you what she did to me. Like, I don't think you need to know that. And I feel like I want to have some dignity in that moment, like if I'm going to tell you all the monsters in my closet, I'm like, I want to still control that, and I think that there is a little bit of my shithead energy where I'm like, oh, I know you want to know what happened. And yeah, let's see if I can manage to not say it. And I feel like that has driven a few people a little bonkers where I'm like, no, I don't want to say that. Like, and it's like, but I don't want to not say it in a way where you think that it's like this like massive like dark cloud. And I'm hoping that I am able to convey that in the book, where it's just like, no, it's fine. And you don't need to know it to see me as a human being who like has that trauma, right? And I think that also as a trauma worker, like I am really not happy with the way we force people to disclose, right? I think that privacy is like the choosing what you want to say is so important, right? And like the piece around dignity, that's the only way you can like actually heal from trauma. And so, yeah, I don't want to tell you, I'm sorry.
And we won't ask. I sorry.
You did.
Yeah. I'm also really interested in I'm really interested in your work in abolitionism, your work, with incarcerated individuals in the US, and how it really relates in different ways to your own sense of, I would say, there's a sense of claustrophobia and captivity that I think exists throughout the text. So there's a really sort of concrete site of imprisonment that you were describing in such sort of almost experiential detail that lends me to believe that something about your experience of a perhaps more atmospheric and metaphorical sense of captivity really lends you to. So I'm interested in the relationship between your abolitionism and perhaps if it might even be described as your anti-Zionism.
You know, it's funny because I have an event in Philly on Saturday, and I didn't tell anybody that I worked with aside from my coworkers that I was writing a book. And so I run group therapy, right, for people who are, I co-run group therapy for people who have been impacted by the system. And they didn't know I was writing a book at all. Like my sense of privacy is pretty intense, in case it wasn't clear. And then I was like, you know what? Actually, integration. I want to actually integrate all the parts of myself. So I invited our community members to come to my reading on Saturday. And I was just talking with one of my clients this morning for our regular weekly phone call. And he was like, explain to me the book. And I was like, well, anti-zionism, abolition. And like, he was rocking with it for a while. And then he was like, you know, and he's an older Black man who spent like, he spent like 20 plus years in prison, right? He's been out for like 5-6 years. And he was like, but you know, I'm a Christian. And in our church, you know, like one of the beliefs that we have is that the state of Israel needs to exist. And he was like really struggling for a minute. And then like, we started talking about it. And like, I was like drawing the parallels of like, you know, I was telling him, you know, during Ferguson, Palestinian activists were teaching Black freedom fighters how to protect themselves from weapons, right? And like I could hear like the wheels turning, you know, and like him starting to understand this really big intersection, right, of being like Black liberation and Palestinian liberation are on the same axis, actually. And like when you think about white supremacy in America, right, like this is the same project that is happening in the Zionist state. And like, you know, it's still a process. I don't think we're quite there yet, but he was like really getting it, you know, and I was like giving him examples, you know, of like apartheid and like all the, you know, genocidal stuff. And like, by the end of it, he was like, no, I understand. And I was like, especially for people who have been incarcerated, like the militarism of the Zionist state makes sense, right? Like the open air prison of Gaza, right? Like they actually understand that because it lives in their body in a specific way. And I feel like for me, right, like the claustrophobia, I know that like there's many generations of my ancestors who have been confined. I know that, right? And I have like archives of that. And so I am a deeply claustrophobic person. And like, I don't know if anybody here has ever visited a prison even, but it is like, it destroys your nervous system. Like every time, like I will go in a prison and you hear the door lock, it's just like my entire body just wants to like completely melt, you know, and fall apart. And so I think that like, and that's the same feeling I would feel going through Ben Gurion Airport, you know, and like being like harassed by like border people, you know, of the Zionist state, you know, it's the exact same feeling for me. So I think that it's like really an embodied thing for me, you know, that I don't know, like if intellectually it quite makes sense, but like, yeah.
Yeah. And the way you write about, I mean, in one scene, you situate yourself, I think, in the position of someone who's incarcerated, and just the way you describe it is so. I don't. I have no words to even reiterate the way she described how you described it. The question that I have now is more so about your Arab Jewish identity, and I'm really interested in what this text does, and this portion that you read earlier that I was really just so blown away by. The question when you talk about editing out the generation that colonized Palestine. And, you know, Arab Jewish critique of the Zionist state, I think, was inaugurated. I'm not going to sort of say that there's an originator of that critique, but it was inaugurated and really launched by a very famous essay by El Shochat called Zionism from the Standpoint of Its Victims. And in that essay, you know, El Shochat speaks about the internment of Mizrahi Jews and the forced migration of Arab Jews out of the Arab lands and their immigration to the state of Israel, the nascent state of Israel. And the article is basically premised on a sense of shared victimhood to, you know, the various violent apparatuses of the state of Israel. And I think that there's a really interesting way in which your Arab Jewish intervention here isn't premised upon a trauma bond, so to speak. And it really allows for the Arab Jewish sort of body to be so much more capacious and so much longer. And I'm just interested in how your Arab Judaism isn't reducible to a critique of Zionism, so to speak.
Yeah, so I was raised in France, so I never have had to identify as a Mizrahi Jew, and that's not a term that I use for myself, and I don't know how familiar people are with this term. But in the Zionist state, people who are not from Europe are kind of lumped together in this identity of Mizrahi. And like there were in internment camps, my grandparents were in one called the Ma'abarots, right, where they were like sprayed with like chemicals and like rehabilitated from their savage ways, you know, that they learned, you know, in their Arab countries, and you know, and there is a deep wound in the Mizrahi like identity, collective identity, and they have been really discriminated against in the Zionist state. And I just want to be very clear that this is not the same wound as the Palestinian wound. And sometimes I get very nervous when this happens, right? And I think that like for me, growing up in France, where I was racialized as an Arab, right? Like that, like I grew up in a city of immigrants with like Moroccans and Tunisians and Algerians and like Egyptians. And so, you know, I had teachers called me Mohammed in school, and that was like, you know, like that was part of my life. And so I would experience that in France, and then I would go to the Zionist state in the summer, and then people were like, no, you're not an Arab, you're a Jew. And I was like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, are you like, we look exactly the same. Like, what are you talking about? And I could not wrap my head around it for a very long time. And I think that like, because of that, I always rejected the Zionist state as like, as an idea. Like that was just like, it did not make any sense. I could not be like the propaganda just didn't work on me, right? And because of that, like I kept just being like, are you all losing your mind? Like, look at what's happening around you. Like there's like 18-year-old with Uzis who are just walking the streets of like, you know, of the cities of the Zionist state. That's bonkers, right? Like, and people were like, oh, you're so French, you're so French. I'm like, well, you know, the French have done a lot of bad things. Let's just be clear about that. But like, maybe, you know, like this type of like genocidal state, not that flavor of it, right? And so because of that, also like my belonging was like, you know, with other North African kids when I was growing up, right? And I think that like my mother really rejected that and really wanted to push me away from that. And when I was in Morocco this time around, like I was in a residency and they were really nervous about me. They were like, you're a non-binary person, you're a Jew, you're talking about Zionism, like we're worried about you. And what ended up happening is because my politics are very clear about Zionism, right? I'm like, no, right? This is just as simple as that. It's just like, no. Like what happened is like, you know, like this thing that sometimes Jewish people have around like the anti-Semitism of the Arab communities. And like, that just never happens to me, right? It has like actually never happened to me as an adult because of the fact that like, it's just very clear that like, we're, you know, we're aligned in our politics, and like, that is, you know, this is like the space that I'm moving into, right? And so, yeah, I don't know. I think that like Arab Jew is something that I do want to claim, because I think that like, you know, as somebody who was born in the Zionist state, finding the word to describe yourself without like signaling that you're a Zionist is actually really complicated, right? Because like there's this thing where I can't talk about, I don't want people to think that I'm like saying that I'm Palestinian, right? Like I was born a Jew in the Zionist state with the blue passport, right? Like I just want to be very clear about that. And so like finding that language, and I think that Arab Jew allows me to express that to people, and while making my like alignment very, very clear. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really just fresh in light of so much of, you know, Mizrahi literature and Arab Jewish interventions and critiques, you know, even today. I mean, I work with Ariel Azoulay, and her work is very much premised on, you know, a shared sense of victimhood. And it's really interesting how your text really veers away from that. So I applaud you for, I think, speaking to something that was seeking out too,
Yeah.
personally, yeah,
But also, I think that part of it is because I didn't have to live that wound,
right.
right? Like, because I wasn't raised there. And I feel like I have friends who were raised in 48 and they have very different experiences, right? Because like they were treated like shit, right? And like constantly, and like their sense of belonging. I think that my sense of like that belonging is easier for me to navigate because I was raised in France for sure.
Yeah. And I mean, there's not much focus on the Arab Jewish diaspora communities, and I think that they're interesting and flourishing in their own different ways. Those were all the questions I had for you prepared. Are we?
Well,
We can open.
we have,
I'm deferring to Mohammed.
I think we have time for a couple of questions, if anybody has them. First off, big round of applause. Two questions, anybody? Anybody like to ask?
Please.
Not, I think we can wrap it up here then, please, one more time.
Wait, we have a question.
Okay.
Hi, what's your relationship with living in America and kind of, I don't know, we don't want to answer that. No, it's totally fine. So I've been living in the US for like permanently for maybe like 11 years now. I've been in Philly for 10. Wow, living in America is really, really hard. Like living in the heart of the empire, like, is just so painful. I was just reflecting on it. I was talking with a friend. So I've been back from Morocco for 2 weeks now. And I can actually feel the hardening in my body starting again, right? Like I was in Morocco and it's like, all right, the funny anecdote is that violence is very different, right? I live in West Philly. I work with people who have been incarcerated. Violence is part of my everyday life, right? Like I de-escalate crises, like guns, like all that stuff is part of my everyday life. And then I got to Morocco and it was Ramadan and people were like, you have to be careful. Around like 6 p.m., everybody loses their mind, right? Because it's like right before people break fast, the smokers are pissed. Everybody has to go to the market to get their stuff, you know, for the store. It's like a whole thing. And what would happen is when a fight starts in Morocco, I'm sorry, it's not that funny, but it's pretty funny. People would have sticks, right? And they would fight with sticks. And like, there's like a guy with a stick, and then there's like 30 people who show up and like break up the fight, and that's over. And people are like, yeah, it's just so dangerous, you know, at that time. And you know, I was like, I live in West Philadelphia. I hear gunshots out of my house every day, right? I'm cool. Like, everybody relax, I'm fine. And people are like, you can't walk here, it's dangerous. And I was like, again, we're fine, we're chilling. And so when I was in Morocco, I noticed just a lot of the armor that you need to like survive America just kind of melting, right? And I was just like, my heart was just like, I could feel my heart just opening in this specific way where I was like, oh, this is who I could be in another environment. And then I came back to the US. And like, it's just so insidious, the way it just like, you can feel like, almost like, you know, when you like, melt plastic and then like it starts to harden progressively, like that's the feeling in my body. And I'm just like, ooh, I don't know if I want to be a plastic person anymore, you know? So I feel like that's maybe the question that I have for myself. Yeah. Hello. Hi. So I really loved your comment about taking writing book as a means of contending with PTSD. And so I'm wondering, what does that look like in terms of like the process of the writing versus now having the actual finished product of the book? How do you feel as if you're contending with it personally? Yes. Not to be too invasive. No, you're fine. Come on, Camille. I feel like, you know, as you know, writing it was a little, like, I think that like, it was easy in some ways because it was just like coming out of me, but also, you know, just like really painful. And like, you know, there were moments where I was like, okay, you're really doing that. But, you know, I've been rereading the book quite a bit for copy edits and other reasons, right? And I'm just like, it's kind of a bizarre experience of like reading yourself as a character, right? And like a lot of the despair that like the book is sad. I just want you to all be clear about that. It's pretty sad at moments, I'm sorry. But I don't feel that despair anymore. It's a different kind of despair, just to be clear. There's a genocide going on, the world is falling apart, there is despair, but it's not despair about that. Right. And I think that like I was just talking about this. I've been working on my second manuscript and I thought it was going to be about grief and like what life could have been if my mother wasn't my mother. And then I was like writing and I wrote a lot of words and then I was like, oh, actually, I don't want to answer that question for myself because I'm kind of over it. You know, I'm good. Like I want to write about like desire and like connection and relationships and expansiveness. And I'm kind of over that piece, which is cool, right? My therapist is very happy. Very, very happy. Yeah.
Final question? Anybody? I saw a hand here. Thought we'd have one more. No, we're good to go. All right, give it up for your readers one more time.